Is God trustworthy? Does he really keep his promises? Is he really good? And can we really trust him? There are times where I think that the answer to that question doesn't come quite so easy. And I wonder if for many of you right now during this time, that question is not an easy one to answer. We look around and we see that there is a global pandemic affecting literally everywhere in the world, and an economic crisis that has sent our world into a tailspin. And we look at the situation around the world and maybe we ask, what is God doing? Does he understand what's going on? Can I really trust him in the midst of all of this? If you're asking that question right now, or if you've ever asked that question, I want you to know that you're actually in good company. You're a lot like Abraham from the Old Testament, because he actually has a history of having a little bit of trouble really trusting God and trusting the promises that he'd made to him. And that brings us to the story that I want to talk about today. It's in Genesis 22. If you have your Bible with you, you can turn there and read along with me. But it's in Genesis 22 where Abraham's trust in God's promise to him is going to face its ultimate test. And as his faith and trust in God's promise has been wavering up to this point in the story, going up and down, it'll face its climactic and ultimate test here. So in Genesis 22 in verses 1 and 2, the story starts like this. It says, "After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you.'" Have you ever gotten horrible news that has come out of the blue? Maybe it's a bad medical diagnosis. Maybe it's the loss of a loved one, the unexpected loss of a loved one out of nowhere, where you just feel like you get hit by a ton of bricks and you're blindsided, and it almost puts you in shock. I like to imagine that as Abraham hears God call out to him and hears God tell him that he wants him to sacrifice his only son, that's exactly how Abraham felt in that moment where God speaks to him. God said, "Sacrifice your son whom you love." Of all the things in Abraham's life that God could have asked for in that moment, I don't think there was possibly anything that could have been more painful than asking for him to sacrifice his son, Isaac. And Isaac wasn't just Abraham's beloved son, but he was truly living proof of this promise that God had made to Abraham that he would have many descendants. Because if Abraham was going to have many descendants, it would depend on truly his only descendant, who in this moment was Isaac, and Isaac alone. And now God is telling him, you have to sacrifice your only son, your beloved son. And it's here where Abraham is faced with this question that he's faced all throughout his journey of trusting in this promise. He's asking, will I trust God even though he's asking me to do something that doesn't make any sense? Will I trust in God in this moment? And God is very purposefully forcing Abraham to ask and answer this question for himself so that he will learn what it really means to trust in him, what it really means to have faith in the promise. A little known fact about me is that I used to be an avid skateboarder. Now, when I say that I was an avid skateboarder, I mean that my mom would send me to the skate park with my wrist guards, my knee pads, my elbow pads, my helmet, and my mouth guard. I was definitely the lamest kid at the skate park, but I was also the safest kid at the skate park. But I would show up to the skate park, and my favorite ramp to get on at the skate park was the half pipe. One of the keys to dropping into the half pipe was that you would put all of your weight forward into your skateboard, lean all the way forward in order to get to the bottom of the ramp and up the other side. Now, The human tendency when going down the half pipe was not to lean all the way forward, but to actually lean back a little bit, because it's terrifying to lean forward looking down into a massive drop into a ramp. But what would happen when you didn't put all of your weight forward into your skateboard is that the skateboard would fly out from underneath you, you'd fall onto your back and slide to the bottom of the ramp. Successfully dropping into the half pipe required completely putting all of your weight forward into the skateboard and down the ramp. Very similarly, what it means to truly have genuine faith in God and to trust in God is to put all of our weight into his promises. Now, our tendency is to maybe put a little bit of weight in his promises, but then to lean back on our own abilities or to trust in ourselves and to put partial weight into God's promises. And that's what Abraham had done up to this point in the story. And now for us in this story, what we're going to see is whether or not Abraham is going to fully place all of his weight in the promises of God, or whether he's going to lean back on his own abilities, on his own plans, on his own wisdom, and wipe out like he has other times in the story. Partially trusting God doesn't work, and true faith in the promised is total and complete trust that holds absolutely nothing back from God. Now we'll see Abraham's response to this difficult test as he embarks here on what is truly the worst father-son camping trip of all time. In verse 3, we can see that Abraham immediately obeys what God has told him to do. It says, "Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about." Abraham immediately obeys what God has told him to do. In verses 4 and 5, on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." Well, in verse 6, we see that Abraham took the wood for the offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took the fire and the knife, and they went on together. And it's just the 2 of them. And Isaac, in verse 7, breaks this awkward silence between them. And he notices what is incredibly obvious here if he would have been walking with his dad, but he says, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" It's an innocent question from Isaac, who notices that the most crucial part for the sacrifice is nowhere to be found. And only Abraham knows in this moment that Isaac is the one who must be the sacrifice. But Abraham, his response here in verse 8, it just puts his growing trust in God on display. Trusting God's promise when he says God himself will provide the sacrifice. In that moment, not knowing completely how true those words would turn out to be. And the anticipation of this tension building reaches its peak in verses 9 and 10. Verse 9, when they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar here and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. He arrived at the place where God had told him to go. There was no more walking, there was no more thinking, there was no more talking to his son. It was the moment of truth. Would he do what God had told him to do? Would he completely put all of his weight and trust into God's promise of what he said he would do, even though it seemed like it was costing him the thing that was most precious to him in the world? 3 long days of hiking, 3 long days of trying to imagine life without his son, 3 long days of trying to wrap his mind around why God would ask him to do something like this. And so in verse 10, we see Abraham lay down his son, raise his knife, close his eyes, and in that moment, make the choice to put all of his weight into God's promises and relinquish the one thing that was more important to him than anything else in the world, his very own son. And in that moment of absolute trust, the angel of the Lord speaks out and to Abraham and stops him. Verses 11 and 12. The angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." How does he know that he had truly expressed genuine fear of God and faith in God? Because he held nothing back from God. He had totally trusted. He had put all of his weight, even the costliest sacrifice, in trusting in God's promises. And it's here that is the turning point in this story, that we've seen Abraham go through the agonizing process of deciding whether or not he was going to place his total trust in God. And when he comes to this point where he decides that he will and that he puts all of his weight into God's promises, God proves to Abraham that he is the one who will provide the sacrifice and that he is, in fact, trustworthy. Verse 13, Abraham looks up, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. He looks up and he sees a ram, the most beautiful sight, a sacrifice, a substitute sacrifice instead of his son, provided by God. What's amazing here and what is so important in this story is that in this test that God has created for Abraham, he doesn't just say, "Okay, I've seen that you trust me and that you believe me and that you are going to trust my promises. Now you can walk back down the mountain." God still requires a sacrifice. Sacrifice must still be made, but the key here is that God is the one who is going to provide the sacrifice. There still has to be a sacrifice. That hasn't changed. But what God is teaching Abraham here is that he is the one who provides so that Abraham doesn't have to. Abraham puts his total trust in God, and God proves here that he is totally trustworthy to provide. Verse 14, Abraham understands this, and he renames the place aptly, "The Lord will provide." And then in following verses 15 through 19, the angel of the Lord speaks again, and God confirms his promise to multiply his family, to give him this land, and to bless him. And because of this total trust, because he put his weight into the promises of God, Abraham experiences this wonderful moment of confirming and reaffirming the promises that God has made to him. And he gets to experience the joy and the satisfaction, the confidence of God himself reaffirming his promise. The faith that Abraham shows us in this story is a wonderful picture and example to us of what true faith actually looks like. In Hebrews chapter 11, the author is writing about faith, and he says, "Faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." That's what faith is. That's what the faith that saves us really looks like. And he uses Abraham in this story as an example of what that faith actually looks like in action. He says a couple verses down, "By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, 'It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned.' Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner speaking he did, receiving Isaac back from death." Abraham had this total trust, even when it meant giving up his son, trusting something that he couldn't see and understand, but trusting because he knew that God was trustworthy. Abraham totally trusted a totally trustworthy God. And now, as we close, I want to leave you with this thought. Even though Abraham is a wonderful picture of what it looks like to have faith, I wonder if he's not the first person in the story that we should actually identify with. Maybe we actually have more in common with Isaac than we have in common with Abraham. If you think about it, the first people who would have read this story would have been the ancient Israelites. And as they would have read this story, they would have looked at Isaac, and they would have seen in Isaac literally their entire existence. They saw in Isaac their great-great-great-great-grandpa, in whom all of them, their entire existence depended. Isaac is laid down on that altar to be sacrificed. Israel looks at themselves and they see themselves and their very existence laid down on that altar. And when a ram is provided by God, and Isaac steps down off that altar and the ram goes there instead, the people of Israel would have recognized that God has provided a ram so that we wouldn't have to be sacrificed. When Isaac looked in the bushes and saw that ram, Israel understood that God provides a sacrifice to die so that they could live. And this story was one of many that gave Israel this deep confidence that they could totally trust this God who is totally trustworthy. And now we fast forward all the way to the New Testament, and we see another sacrifice that has to be made. It's a sacrifice for sin, and it's a sacrifice that is required by you and by me. But for those who place their total trust in this totally trustworthy God who has proven over and over and over again that he is the one who provides the sacrifice, we can look up now and see not a ram in a bush, but we can see a lamb on a cross. And we can see that God has provided another, an ultimate substitutionary sacrifice in our place in giving his son, Jesus. You see, God spared Isaac, who was Abraham's only beloved son, because of the very fact that one day he would give his very own beloved son in our place. Genesis 22 is a small picture looking forward to ultimately what God would do in sending his son as a sacrifice for us, providing the ultimate provision and proving in the greatest way that he is a trustworthy God. While Abraham and Isaac had to look forward to the promise that God will provide, you and I have the opportunity to fully put all of our weight and trust into the fact that God has provided, that he did provide his son on a cross as a substitute, as a sacrifice for you and for me. Isn't that a God who is worth putting all of our trust in, putting all of our weight in? Can't we say with Paul in Romans that he who did not spare his own son but gave him up for us all, how will he not also along with him graciously give us all things? I wonder, have you ever totally entrusted all of yourself, even the most precious things in your life, to a God who has proven over and over again that he is entirely trustworthy? I want to challenge you today to stop leaning back on your own resources. Stop leaning back on your own power and abilities, but entrust all of yourself to the God who has proven all throughout the course of history that he is trustworthy. And even when it cost him the thing that was most precious to him, he gave up his only son so that you and I could live. That is the kind of God who deserves total trust, who has earned our total trust through giving the ultimate sacrifice for you and I. Trust in him today. And don't just partially trust in God today. Totally and completely put all of your weight into Jesus today, because he has proven that he is trustworthy.